Mark, what exactly is depression?
Well, depression is a syndrome. It's a combination of symptoms that occur at the same time. So most people know what sadness is. Most people know sometimes how difficult it is to get up out of bed out in the morning and this sort of thing. Depression is different from that. It's low mood, feeling hopeless, feeling very sad and listless, but also it can be lack of energy and enthusiasm for things that you used to actually quite enjoy. And those are the core symptoms of depression. But even then, if you get those for a couple of weeks and they go on and on and on, that's not enough to get you a diagnosis of depression. So there are other symptoms as well, and any combination, 4 or 5 of these other symptoms are often considered necessary for a diagnosis of a clinical depression. And they are things like changes in appetite, perhaps even weight loss, or sometimes people eat too much and weight gain. Changes in sleep, so that some people don't get to sleep at night, or they can't sleep in the middle of the night, or they wake up very early in the morning. Occasionally, especially with something called seasonal affective disorder, it's sleeping too much and not, feeling that you want endless sleep. But generally with depression, it's not sleeping, it's insomnia. And then there are things like feeling guilty, lacking concentration, feeling agitated or very slowed down, feeling tired all the time, and even many people get suicidal ideas they'd rather be dead, that they're just a burden to their family. Now, what depression is these symptoms coming together most days for at least 2 weeks. In general, however, they go on for months, and that's when you'd get a diagnosis of depression.
Depression is increasing worldwide. Or is it increasing predominantly in the developed world, or is it also increasing in the third world?
So in about 2 decades ago, they recognized that depression was becoming a big problem. In high and middle income countries, depression is the top of the list for that. So it's higher than the disability caused by heart disease, for example, cerebrovascular disease, road traffic accidents. And even in low income countries and very low income countries, it's still in the top 10 of years lost to disability.
So depression actually exacts a bigger toll on society than cancer and heart disease and other things like osteoarthritis?
Indeed. In terms of its global impact, of course there's the suicide impact as well. Nearly 1 million people die prematurely by suicide each year across the world. But also there's the more hidden cost as well as the big cost of things like suicide. People feeling like they can't function, feeling like staying in bed rather than getting up, which is not just laziness, this is depression. Can
you give us some figures as to the prevalence of depression, both in the developed world and the developing world?
What epidemiologists seem to find wherever they look is about 1 in 20 of the population are depressed at any one time, and about 20% of the population at some point will get very depressed, and that's a major problem.
Every time I hear these figures, I'm just completely stunned. What's the fundamental driving force behind the increase in depression?
One of the biggest clinical studies ever conducted was done in America. It was called the STAR-D trial. So they had 4,000 people who volunteered to take part. And as part of that trial, they were asking them, when did you first get depressed? And they found that the mean age of onset in this sample was about 26, but actually the most common age in which people started to get depressed was between 13 and 15 years old. And that is an astonishing new development.
So does this suggest that depression is really a problem of how we deal with the world, the way we think, rather than a chemical imbalance in the way our brains are actually working?
Well, one of the inferences we can make from these big changes being so rapid and recent is that it can't be genetic changes. It can't be driven by our basic biological makeup. So there must be something else happening, and it must be environmental changes that have driven that. I mean, clearly it could be that people are just recognizing depression that was always there, but now they're recognizing it more. But the fact that both clinical studies and epidemiological studies show up the same thing argues that it's not just that people are recognizing it better, because you control for the sort of questions you can ask and check that the questions asked are the same over those decades. But the other thing is that we know that after about 1977, you got increases in changing rates of suicide as well, especially in young men. Right the way over the Western world, you got increases in the suicide rate, which to some extent mimicked this younger and younger depression hitting. Now that's stabilised over the last few years, but the fact that you get really confirmation from another area that we know is likely to have been affected by this changing pattern of depression, I think, shows that something's going on here. It's very difficult to understand exactly what the causes are. Changing patterns of society, the increase in the gap between rich and poor, the fact that when economies develop rapidly, often there seem to be some almost unavoidable changes in the gaps between rich and poor. We know that in the countries that have the least gaps between rich and poor, then the levels of stress, the levels of trust even within the communities are higher, the levels of hope are higher, and people tend to live longer in those societies. So there are little bits of evidence that people are beginning to put together to suggest what the changes might have been.
If you had to choose fundamental driving forces behind depression, what would they be?
Well, at the individual level, they're the way we think about life. So where we feel we are, as it were, in relation to other people, in relation to our own standards and the standards that other people set for us. So one of the ways in which society is changing is the way in which it expects us to do things, the targets it sets for us and so on. And when society sets us targets and says, meet those or else, then the best you can hope for from your work is relief when you've met your targets.
Does depression inevitably return, or is it possible to just have one episode of depression and that's it for the rest of your life? You get over it, you dust yourself down and carry on with the rest of your life. Is that possible, or does it tend to return?
Statistics suggest that about 50% of people might have a one-off episode and then it doesn't bother them again. But if they've been depressed twice, the chances to get depressed again are much higher, 3 times, and the rates are about 70 to 80%.
So people who become repeatedly depressed year after year, what proportion of their lives do they actually spend in that depressed state?
The figures are staggering. What they found was, and it's just been published in the last couple of years, is that people on average spend 32% of their time in episode over the 20-year period. So on average, 4 months a year are spent in episodes of depression, which, I mean, considering the burden that we talked about earlier, it's an incredible statistic.
That's a really disturbing statistic. What proportion of people then go on to begin self-harm or even commit suicide?
We know that the rates of suicide in people who've been seriously depressed are elevated compared with the general population. Now, about 1% of the population die by suicide anyway.
Is suicide always linked with depression?
It's the most closely linked problem, so that even, I mean, you get elevated risk of suicide in other mental health problems like schizophrenia, for example, or bipolar disorder, but it's the depressive aspect of schizophrenia. So many people can survive, as it were, having serious mental health problems in an amazingly courageous way, but depression takes away that hope. And it's when hopelessness comes, which tends to come with depression, that actually people become at greater risk of suicide.
Do people tend to kill themselves as they come out of a depression rather than when they actually have the kind of hopelessness and the lack of energy when they're in the teeth of a depression?
There's quite a lot of clinical evidence for that. It's never been proven by research. It's a very difficult thing to prove, but many people have said that they thought that the person was actually feeling happier now, and the natural inference is exactly as you suggest, that people, when they're very, very depressed, actually have very little energy, and that it's when the energy starts to come back, but the mood has not yet improved, that is a very dangerous time. And one of the interesting things that's emerged in the last few years is that when you get repeated depressions, you can get depressed again and again, but different symptoms can be there each time, so that always those core symptoms seem to be there, like low mood and lack of interest. But the other things like weight loss, sleep loss, guilt, they may or may not be there. But our research in Oxford has found that of all the symptoms that recur when depression recurs, suicidal feelings are the most recurrent.
So what exactly does a full-blown depression feel like?
It's a combination of experiences, of distortions, you might say, in the way you think, the way you feel, the body and your impulses. So if you take each in turn, your thoughts are dominated by ideas of helplessness, rejection, being a failure, not being good enough, not being worth your space in the world. You feel like the lowest of the low, and that nobody wants you, nobody likes you, and that even if they do like you, that's because they haven't found out the truth about you, you're just a fraud, and as soon as they find out what you're really like, they'll reject you. So your thoughts are dominated by that. That becomes a habit. Secondly, your feelings get bombarded. There's feelings of sadness, of hopelessness, of worthlessness, and they're very closely tied in with your thoughts. If you can imagine somebody standing behind you all day saying how useless you were, then sooner or later you'd feel sad, irritable, run down, exhausted, and a miserable failure. And that's the way in which the feelings reflect those thoughts. I mean, if you look at the way people walk when they're depressed, for example, their gait is very different. Not, as it were, walking upright, walking slouched, going from side to side instead of actually more steady on their feet. And lastly, your behaviour is affected. You don't, either you feel like you feel suicidal, but also you feel like withdrawing from the world. And that sense of withdrawal, of not wanting to see things. Now, once again, most of us have had times in our life when the phone rang and we thought, oh, no, do I have to answer that? Or when we didn't want to get up in the morning and anybody could have seen we were, quite sort of withdrawn. But that goes on relentlessly. It feels like it goes on relentlessly in depression. And when you put these together, the thoughts, the feelings, these body changes and your impulse to act or your behavioural tendency to withdraw, then that is what drags you down. It's not surprising then that people feel the burden and can't function when they've got all of this going on in their life.
Thanks very much for that, Mark.